Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to thank and pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hi everyone, and welcome to Room by Room, the Home Organization Science Insights podcast, produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We're champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element, with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Gabriella Yastra, coming to you from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's begin.
Welcome back to the show. Imagine turning your kitchen scraps from trash into treasure, not just saving money, but transforming waste into wealth right before your eyes. Today, we're looking at the world of repurposing food waste, where every banana peel, piece of stale bread, and wilting vegetable is an opportunity, not an afterthought. And guiding us through this is environmental engineer Belinda Li, who specializes in solid waste management and food system planning. So welcome to the show, Belinda. How are you going today?
I'm great. How about you?
I'm good too, and it's great to have you here. I'm really excited to talk about this. I love cooking, and I do whatever I can to minimize food waste, but I do feel that areas that I can improve in, and I do think that's where a lot of people are. So I'm really excited to talk to you about this. But before we begin, do tell us about your background and what compelled you to pursue environmental engineering.
Yes, for sure. I grew up in a region that was quite polluted. So it's a very industrialized region. It's in Southern Ontario in Canada. So that's in the area where there's a lot of production, of manufacturing, things like that. And as a child, I saw the effects of that on the air, on the water, the Great Lakes region, heavily polluted region, on the soil. I saw how that made a lot of people sick, right? Both short and long term illnesses, and the surrounding wildlife and plants. So you could see how things were not doing very well. And I wanted to do something about that. Now, of course, there's a lot of different ways that you can make change in that area of preserving the natural environment or keeping it from being polluted. But I would consider myself an implementer and a problem solver. So engineering was a good fit for that. So I ended up doing an environmental engineering degree coming out of high school, and I worked in that sector. I'm a professional engineer, registered in British Columbia in Canada. And then following that, as I was working on these environmental challenges, I was really seeing the social connection. So I started focusing on solid waste management, and I felt like I was just going further and further upstream. And my focus was, first of all, on what we call organic waste, so things that are compostable. And then I kept on tracing it. And then I noticed, okay, this is actually a broader food systems issue, and we need to merge those social and environmental, economic, all those different intersecting aspects. So that's got me into research on food and food waste, which I'll talk a little bit about. And then now I'm doing my doctorate on actually something related to food waste, which is community composting. So it all kind of comes around when you look at it from a systems perspective.
Yeah, that's amazing. And what a journey. So what would you say is the biggest misconception that people have about food waste or repurposing food waste as an environmental engineer?
I would say it's a mindset. The fact that we call it waste to begin with, it represents how we value something. If we consider it waste, we're kind of already devaluing it, right? So in some of the work we do, we actually really encourage just changing the language and changing how people think about it. Because if you think about something as, oh, this is something good for my garden, or this is actually a free ingredient for my next meal, then it doesn't become something you need to get rid of anymore. So it would be, say, your leftovers, it's your extras, it's your scraps, it's kind of anything but waste.
Yeah, I love it. And do you guys get raccoons in Canada? Because I'm thinking, like, with regards to food waste, right? We see it food waste, but to them, it's food. It's just food. And so, like you said, you can always change that framing a little bit. But anyway, that's a great preface for our topic for today. Sorry about the weird um, raccoon little deviation. But before we get further into detail, I would love to get to know you better. So this is Have You Met Belinda? And the first question I have for you is, what do you like to do in your spare time?
I really like to cook, right? So, beyond just the work that I do, which is related to food in my actual life, I am a foodie. I like exploring different types of food. And I feel like every time I cook something, because I am trying to use stuff up, then it's what one of my friends calls a once in a lifetime recipe. So every time it's different and it's every time it's remixed because I'm trying to just use whatever there is. And that also makes it a lot of fun. Also, related to raccoons, yes, we have lots of raccoons here. And some of the people I work with in the waste world, we kind of consider ourselves raccoons because we are excited by these things, or we are going through other people's waste to better understand what's going on. And so we have a bit of a kinship to the raccoons.
Exactly. We should all be more like raccoons. So is there a vegetable or a food item that you enjoy working with in particular, especially when it comes to, reincorporating it into the next dish that you want to make?
That's a really good question. I don't think I have a particular favorite, but I do find a lot of times it's the more kind of starchy tubular root vegetables. I really like those because there's so many different uses for them. They store for such a long time, and a lot of them are pretty mellow in terms of flavor, so they absorb a lot of different things. For example, with potatoes, you can pretty much remix potatoes that you've used a few different ways and a few different times, right? If you just have some that you've already cooked, like one thing can get turned into, say, something more crispy and baked, and another one could go into a soup. And there's so much versatility with it.
Yeah, I do love working with potatoes as well. I used to actually despise doing it because I wouldn't know what to do with the skin. But ever since I started just like making crisps out of the skins, and it's really good, highly recommend. It does take a little bit of time, but turning cooking into a hobby rather than a necessity or a chore has been really helpful in getting the motivation to do that. But what are some of your favorite scrappy cooking tricks?
That's also a great question because I often don't think about them as scrappy cooking tricks because they're just something I do. I think, again, it's how you perceive what you have. So, whenever I make something and there's something left over, I consider that to be the input to the next thing. And I look at it almost as seriously a freebie. I've already prepped this. I've already got this ready. I don't even have to go and buy it. It's just sitting there in my fridge.
Yeah.
And so I think it's seeing everything kind of just as an input to the next thing. Then you end up almost reimagining what cooking is.
Yeah, I love that. I'll definitely be thinking about that a lot more in future cooking. I've never really thought of it that way in terms of like changing the perspective, but I can see how that will be really useful. But aside from cooking, is there anyone that you look up to either in your professional life or personal life? And I don't mean raccoons, I mean people.
I mean, I do look up to raccoons, but there are people as well. Definitely, I would say personally and in a way professionally, my parents, and specific to food, my mom. So on my mom's side of the family, I grew up helping out with our family business, which was producing food and also selling it. And a lot of those values of, I remember she would say, like, every little bit of food you're throwing out that money. That's money we could have been making. And that really translated to how I see things. And she is just a very thrifty, resourceful person. I would say sometimes like she kind of outdoes me in terms of reusing stuff and not really have anything that's wasted. So I really look up to her for doing that, and the creativity, because she would just say, yeah, just like put this in here, and then I put these other peels and that turns into soup for your dad because your dad likes soup, and it's great.
For sure. I remember feeling that way about my grandmother as well, who she cooked all of her life. So she was really like, she just had the knack for like knowing where to put things without a recipe. And it's always been inspiring to me. That definitely resonates with me as well. And the last question I have for you in the Have You Met section is there a class or a course that you've taken that has stuck with you to this date?
There is. And I think it really reflects some of the ways I approach different problems. And this was a course, multiple courses in systems thinking and modeling, because when you start seeing things from that perspective of like, what is really the root cause of this problem? And what are some of these leverage points that you might not always see if you're just kind of sticking in your discipline or you're not trying to make the connections? And I think that's really what's needed to create the changes we need to see in the world.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. It does sound really helpful to everyday life, even. So thank you really so much for sharing that with us. Now let's move on to the interview section. And for starters, how would you define home organization?
I think home organization is having a system that works for you so that you can live your life in the way that you want to live it.
Yeah. And what about minimization? What is your definition of that?
I mean, I think in the words, it seems kind of self obvious. It's just not having waste. And I would define waste as things that you really can't do anything else with them, that you do need to throw away. So it would be going into, say, the landfill or into incineration. So it's pretty much doing whatever you can so that it doesn't end up kind of at that endpoint of being disposed.
Yeah. And what are some examples of things like food that are truly waste that you can't use anymore?
Well, I guess it depends on what you consider being able to use, right? So if you consider it just, okay, we can't eat it, then yes, there's lots of stuff, right? You've got your heavy pits, avocado pits or bones or the outsides of a pie. Like there are these things like you really, as a human, can't really eat it. So I still wouldn't consider that waste because you can use that to feed the soil. Eventually, if you get that into compost, it might take a bit longer because these don't break down as readily, but it is something that goes back to feed the soil. And I think I'm very biased because my research is on composting and I've done composting outreach and things like that for a long time. But I wouldn't really consider that to be waste. Although we
Yeah.
can maybe put it in the category of it's not edible for humans. And so, in a way, we do need to put it somewhere.
Yeah. And from your experience, what is the extent of food waste in households? What are the main causes of them?
Sure. So, my research has mostly been based in Canada and also in more urban areas. I have, of course, done readings and looked at things in other parts of the world as well. But in this context, a lot of it is leftovers. So when we've done what we call waste composition studies, or we've done food dryers where people write out what they have wasted at home, a good amount of it is stuff that people prepared and then they couldn't eat it anymore, or it's spoiled and they had to throw it out. And then the other part is over purchasing. So it's a lot of stuff that people bought, they didn't use it, it's spoiled, they had to throw it out. That really makes up a big part of it. And in terms of the types of food, a lot of it's fruits and vegetables. It's the stuff that spoils the fastest.
Yeah, for sure. I remember one time I did try to, because I had to leave on. I had to go back to Singapore because there was a death in the family, and I had meal prepped all this food for the week, and it was steamed egg and pork, minced pork. It's a Chinese dish, and I put it in the freezer, thinking like, oh, when I get back, I can just eat it. But I don't know what happened. Something happened, but the egg coagulated and it wasn't smooth steamed egg anymore. I don't know what it is. And I didn't know if I could eat it anymore. I guess that I could probably, I actually I haven't thrown it away. It's still in my freezer. I'm not gonna lie, because I can't bear to do that. So like, what are your thoughts on that?
It's tricky, right? I mean, if you're brave and you're wanting to experiment a bit, you could always try to heat it up and eat it. And then if it really doesn't work out for you, there might be someone else who's willing to try it. And if you really just can't find anyone, and hoping that you might have some place that you can bring organics to for composting, then it can go there. Or I don't know if pets might be interested in that. That's kind of usually people, if they have a dog who is happy to eat any of those things, then it's another way that you can put that to good use.
Right, that's a good idea. I haven't thought about finding someone with a dog, because me and a lot of my friends, we have cats, and they can't eat garlic or onion of any sort, and my food is riddled with that. So those are out. So good advice. Find someone with a dog and ask them if they want to try out this food. But to go back to what we were discussing before, how would you describe the relationship between waste minimization and home organization?
That's a really good question. I would say that in many ways, when you do have, say, some system, whatever it may be, because so much of the food that gets thrown out, it's from spoilage, or it's from not being stored, or that type of thing. That's the link. It's kind of when you've got more of a system for home organization, then that does reduce how much you end up throwing away, because there's a purpose for these different things, or there's a place for them. There's a plan for how they're going to be used.
Yeah. And what would you say are the implications of food waste, both for individuals and society, the world, and the environment as a whole?
There's so many, we can spend a whole hour talking about them, but very briefly, individually, there's a few things. A lot of times the campaigns say, oh, you're wasting money in a way, right? You bought some stuff, or you grew some things and you put some time into it, and then you're throwing it away. And then what I also like to bring up for individuals is just think about the care or the time, like especially if it was someone who cooked this for you, or you cooked it yourself. Like you're kind of going, yeah, I put all this time into this, and then off it goes. And then more broadly, think about the people who would have been involved in that, right? The whole chain and the waste of the resources. So we're kind of putting all this time and energy into something that we're throwing away. But then on the impact side, just to get that out there, it is a huge contributor to greenhouse gases, right? Not just from whatever's being thrown out, because if it does go into a landfill, it's generating methane. And we know that methane contributes to climate change through global warming. But it's also all of the emissions, all of that stuff that went into producing that food in the first place. That essentially is extra greenhouse gases we did not need to produce, right? And then there's the other environmental implications of the waterways, right? Like if you have such intensive growing so that we can grow a bunch of food so that we can throw away a good chunk of it, right? The figure globally, sits at about say 30%. That's a bunch of pollution we could also avoid. So it's a huge impact all over the place. And then on the economic side, not just individually, if you are a food business, essentially when you're throwing out that food, you're kind of throwing out your profits.
And what about composting?
Composting is a great way to be able to put use to that food that you can't really eat. And it kind of depends on where you live and also what resources you have around you. If you live in a place where you have access to, say, a yard or just a place outside, then you can compost right at home. So you can either build or get a composter, like very, very simple, pretty much some type of container that allows you to put all your food scraps in there. And then essentially it's just mixing it with some yard trimmings and then letting it sit for a while. You might need to add a little bit of water to it, or you might need to add some air to it. That's pretty normal, but it's pretty much like minutes every few days. Then you'll be able to harvest that compost later and be able to use it, say, for your gardens or for growing more food. So you're really literally like closing your entire food loop right at home. And if, say, that's not available, I mean, I live in an apartment. I am bringing my food scraps to one of my friends. So again, leaning on people that you know. And if you are in one of the larger cities or places that do have some type of curbside compost collection program, and now I've seen them, they're in smaller towns as well, then you can use your green bin and put it in there.
Yeah. I do know though that some people are put off by the smell of compost indoors. So, what would you recommend being an alternative?
Yeah. So there's some tips for how to make it a little bit less icky and kind of like your food. You can put your compost bucket into the freezer or into the fridge, and that could be helpful in the summer when it gets hot, or just in general if you really don't like the smells, because it'll actually keep it from spoiling as much. Another thing is a lot of people, they don't like having, a little bit of ickiness at the bottom of the bins. And so putting, say, some old like scrap paper bags or just any type of more absorbent material at the bottom of that helps. So when you dump it out, then it kind of just comes out with it. And then depending on also where your bin is, if you take out the food scraps a little bit more regularly, then that also can help with reducing smells.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think when previous guests have also identified that it's not about this particular food just being wasted. It's also about the supply chain and all the resources put into creating or growing that product only for it to be wasted. And that's always struck a chord with me because without any of this knowledge, I wouldn't have thought of that. And now it just feels a lot more weighty, or it feels a lot more, I guess, serious to just throw it in the bin like it's nothing. But what do you think? What is meant by repurposing food waste? What are some examples of doing that?
Yeah, and I think this is where the terminology matters a little bit, because I would see repurposing food, maybe not food waste, as something where you're still making it into something that, say, you would eat. Whereas I would consider taking that and composting, that's more like transforming. So just to be clear on terminology. So repurposing essentially is, hey, this is something that might be conceived as waste by someone, and we are going to make it not waste. And we're going to make it into something, and it's going to be delicious, and you're going to eat it.
Yeah. And what are some examples that you can share about, both sides where you either transform it into compost or turn it into a different food dish?
Great. I would say, in terms of repurposing, a lot of it is going back to traditions that have been in place forever. I think a lot of times people think of things as being new, like, oh, now we're worried about food waste. We need to find some new ways to deal with it. Instead, if you pause and look at what people have done before, many cultures have some dishes where it's pretty much chopping up a bunch of stuff and sticking into dough, right? Dumplings, or maybe on top of dough, pizza. There's a lot of ways where the food that you're making, it's actually meant for these leftovers. Or I also come from Chinese ancestry, and you actually are supposed to use leftover rice to make fried rice because it's better. And what do you toss in with it? Just whatever you have that you want to chop into small pieces. So that's a really good way to repurpose, and also to not feel like it's a burden, because a lot of these things, like, who doesn't like pizza? Maybe some people don't like pizza, but these are dishes a lot of people eat regularly, and you can actually make them from these little bits and bobs. So I think that's the way to do it, is just keep cooking, but maybe do it a little bit differently.
Yeah, that's a great example. It really reminds me of how, so in Singaporean culture, there's so many dishes that are very similar to what you've described, like char kway teow or like bee hoon, and a lot of people have specific like desire, specific likes and dislikes in their bee hoon or char kway teow, for example. But the reason it ever even became a dish in the first place is because the because the people in the past wanted to create something that was economically friendly, something that they can use a bunch of vegetables that's were just from anywhere, like diverse. So you can literally put anything you want in it. It's just to make a dish that is hearty and will use up leftovers and from any literally any vegetable or any additive, and it's just a dish. It's like a noodle salad, if you will, because you can put anything you want in it. And yeah, and it actually, I think knowing these things, that's it's what people did in history, can help like reframe our mindsets of using leftovers, right? So that's a really good example, and thank you for sharing that and reminding me, because I actually forgot for a little bit. And with regards to storing food, because this is a really important part of extending the life of our foods and making sure they don't go to waste. What is your advice for that? Are there any effective ways of doing so?
Yeah, well, it's very dependent on what the food is. And I would say there's lots of resources for food storage. And a lot of those you can find in a lot of places where they do have some of these food loss and waste prevention campaigns. And I think Australia has Let Food Hate Waste, and Canada has it as well. But generally, it's a lot of things can go in the fridge or the freezer, and just having something that is kept cold, right? It just gives it a bit more time. It's not going to break down as quickly. And of course, some things probably shouldn't go in very specific stuff, such as, now I don't want to be quoted on this necessarily because I'm not an expert, but for example, like you might not be putting potatoes or onions into the fridge because that can affect their storage and stuff like that. Although I think some people do. So that's why, that's kind of the advice that tends to be given, but keep it in a cool, dark place, right? Anyway, there's different opinions about that, but it's make something that works for you, but using those tools helps a lot. And also it's having some way to less so doing the storage, but having a plan to use them, because you can be great at putting things in the right place at the right temperature and whatever, but if you're not using it, eventually it will spoil. So it's having storage and some way to maybe indicate, hey, we got to use this soon. So in my case, I actually put little dates onto things when I'm storing them. So it kind of gives me a reminder, hey, I got to use this.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I have to say, I'm one of the guilty people putting potatoes and onions into the fridge. I didn't realize that. Well, I had an inkling because I never saw people putting it in the fridge. So I guessed that I just took social cues and was like, okay, I think I'm not supposed to put it in there. But also, I realized that it's so disruptive to my cooking workflow because my potatoes and onions are in a separate place and all the vegetables are in the fridge. So I suppose it's all up to how you do things in your home, because at the end of the day, if you're not wasting it, it's fine. And I always remember to it's always in the fridge, so I see it all the time. Whereas if I put it somewhere else, I never see it and I completely forget about it. I have had a bag of potatoes just sitting there in my cupboard for a month and I've completely forgotten to use it and would go and get new potatoes. So I guess it all boils down kind of to how you run things in your household, right?
Yeah, which is why that's my definition of home organization. It's a system that works for you. And it might not be optimal according to whatever all the resources say, but if it works for you, then it works for you.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. I think the last thing I wanted to ask you about is about bulk buy stores, which, are all the rage, and such as Costco, which have drawn in household consumers. I feel like I don't know if this is just me. I don't have a statistic, but I feel like more and more how individual household consumers are going to Costco. Bulk buy stores such as Costco for the competitive prices. And that kind of leads to this buy in bulk, then freeze the rest kind of culture. So, what are your thoughts on this? And what do you think we can do to get the best deals while remaining mindful of food waste? Oh, food waste, of wasting food. Well, I meant food waste actually. Yeah.
It's okay. I use the terms interchangeably regularly. I would say that it's sharing. And the reason I mention that is because I have a bulk buying club. So what you do is there's probably some other people you know who might want to split a case of something. So you can still take advantage of those deals, but you're not stuck with having everything in your home. I live in an apartment. I don't have space to store that many things. And also, if you buy so much and you're not able to use it up in time, then you have to throw it away. And I think that it is in, say, a lot of the communities, how people live, what they're used to, it might not be as typical for people to be reaching out to others and saying, hey, who wants to split a case of this? But it doesn't mean we can't start. And doing that, it helps build community, right? You can maybe get to know some of the people around you a bit better, or you can share the task, right? So for example, this week it's my turn. I'm going to go grab all this stuff. And then next week is someone else. And then I didn't have to make a trip to the store. So sharing is caring, and it helps in all these other ways as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point there. I tend to also just because I don't have a car and can't drive, and it's really hard to like transport these bulk products back to my apartment. So I just kind of find people who can drive or have a car and be like, I have a Costco membership. Do you want to come with me? And then we kind of like split things along the way as well. And that really helps. And it's a bonding experience, truly. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that with us. I have had such a good chat. Now let's talk about some of the everyday application of what you have just shared with us. So, what is a habit that you'd recommend practicing when it comes to repurposing food? Not waste,
Ah,
food.
yeah, it's food. It's checking what you have. So it's if you're there, take a look at what's around and think about what you can do with it, right? They call it shop at home before going to the store.
Yeah, and do you have any examples of how you've done this in the past?
I literally, when I'm opening the fridge, I do a quick scan to see what's in there. And it takes a couple seconds. And it's something where if you get into that habit, you're almost, it becomes in the front of mind of, oh, what else do I have here that I might be able to use?
Yeah, that's a really good one. But what are the challenges that arise when attempting to start practicing this habit, especially for the everyday how like household person?
I think a lot of it has to do with just having the capacity to do that. And we've seen that in our research as well. A lot of people are very busy. They have so many different things that they need to attend to. And the food that's in your fridge is not necessarily at top of mind. And you need to kind of almost create a little bit of space for that. Not saying that it's not possible, but it could be a big barrier to overcome. Say, if the thing you need to do is just make sure your kids get to school or something like that.
Yeah, and what's your advice for facing that or overcoming that challenge?
This is where I think I'm going to put a little bit of the responsibility on not an individual, because I feel like a lot of times we have this blame the consumer type of mentality. And of course, you can have people make some changes on their own to overcome these, but a lot of it is, in a lot of cases, people are just very stressed because they have so many things they need to deal with, and alleviating that's going to take a whole bunch of changes to, say, our government policies, say for income or for different supports and social supports so people can feel more comfortable. But I guess in terms of things that people can do, it's the maybe try to get some motivation with people around you, right? Like make it competitive, talk about it with other people, and then it becomes something that isn't as off to the side or like strange to do. It's something that's more normalized. Or within a household, share it with somebody else. So it could be, okay, I'm going to be checking this. Is someone else going to be checking this as well?
For sure. I think sharing with friends that you've done this really helps as well. This is something that I try to do when I do repurpose food, and it always feels really gratifying and motivating to get that external validation. Of course, like you don't live off of external validation, but it helps with encouraging each other to repurpose your food. You encourage someone else because you inspire them to do it. You show like, hey, yeah, like I have a similar schedule to yours. I managed to do this the other day, and shows like if I can do it, you can do it. And then it's kind of like a nice little exchange of ideas as well and motivation. So I really like that. So thank you for sharing that with us and for joining us today on the podcast. I really appreciate it. And I've been really enjoying this conversation. I don't know if you can tell. But now let's move on to the open mic. This is your chance to talk about anything that you are passionate about, and it doesn't have to be related to the topic. So the floor is entirely yours. Please take it away.
Of course. Well, it's actually related to this because I am volunteering with the Food Waste Prevention Week, which is a kind of week long blitz to really get food waste prevention on people's minds and to create that change of like, hey, it's not food waste. Like, just don't waste it. It's food. This is something that started out in the US, but we're getting more partners now that are coming in around the world. And so it's an exciting time right now because the event is in April and we're getting people to sign up. So generally, it's people are interested in being part of Food Waste Prevention Week, then they just need to go to foodwastepreventionweek.com to check it out.
Amazing. And what does the week entail? What are activities or events that are going on?
I'll just speak to the committee that I'm part of, which is the webinars committee. So we are going to have a nice week of different webinars that people can join in, ranging in topics that are, say, more for the individual person or household, all the way to businesses or governments who are trying to launch programs or change their policy. So there's something for everyone. And I'm really excited this year because it seems like we're getting quite a bit of interest from a lot of different places to put on webinars so that people would be able to see examples that might be quite relevant to their own situation.
That's amazing. And what are you personally most looking forward to with the food prevention week? Wait, food waste prevention week.
Yes, Food Waste Prevention Week. I this year I'm quite excited to see just who gets engaged and where it spreads to because year after year it's gotten bigger and bigger, and I think looking at what partners are going to be involved that are outside of the US, that's really saying, I mean, I'm probably, I think, the only committee member that is from Canada, so I've tried to spread it to other places as well. But that, I think it's just the scale of where it's going to get to.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting. So that's a great use of open mic right there. Thank you for sharing that with us and for joining us today, Belinda. I wish the Food Waste Prevention Week all the best. I hope to see it myself as well. But if our listeners want to find out more about you and what you do, where can they go?
Yes, they can go to foodsystemslab.ca. That is the website for my research group.
Amazing. We'll link those in the show notes. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. All this food talk has got me really hungry. So I'm about to have lunch after this. And we'll catch you in the next episode.